they're first of all not involved in the design, which makes it very difficult for them to adopt these technologies. And I'm talking about systems like having a fundraising database or an MIS, etc. Once they get locked into certain vendors, they're unable to create systems which talk to each other. They're unable to afford them, so they stop using it after a year or so. So when we talk about open source and that distribution of power, we are again not necessarily looking at it holistically. Not all these organizations truly have access to those technologies, mostly because they're not involved in designing them. They're not, the true requirements are not really listened to by these technologists who design them for them. And now AI is just adding that level of complication. Um, so Asad, just to answer your initial question about the summit, I think it's great that the event has become a public-facing event. So it's pushed that Overton window. Everybody is talking about it now. So I don't necessarily know what the outcome is going to be, but um, hopefully it's positive. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
Perfect. Eli, I mean, as Indians, we have a very specific view into the world, and I wondered, like, do some of the concerns as well as the opportunities that Arjun and Anirudh both have highlighted, do they also resonate in your work and how you're thinking about the role of open source as they meet community organizations?
Thank you. Thank you. And so I think we're starting to see that play out more with AI, right? And so you are seeing communities and community organizations, you know, take models and build on top of them, take the data that they have sovereignty and control over as their agency that way. And I think that there's so many different use cases around the world, whether here in India or overseas, that we are seeing some really neat innovations and some really neat opportunities. I tend to be particularly excited by some of the opportunities at the application layer. Because if you think about all the things that you can build on top of an open source LLM to try to solve whatever the problem is, whether it is you need a new way to let your children do their homework and pursue education on a low latency network or something, all the way over to farming use cases. It's really everything. So part of the challenge of this panel is to sort of bound what we're talking about and think about sort of what are those exciting applications, and then also going into the infrastructure stack. And so I do think all of the concerns and opportunities you so eloquently described really are broadly relevant outside of India as well.
But you said, like, to just zone in, and I think that one thing that we often hear about is that open source technologies are the way to also enhance accountability, not just and use that even to what Anirudh was saying, to make sure that we're able to create transparency around it, able to use our own data more meaningfully, not get locked in. And I think just on that vein, and I've seen some of the work that Hewlett has done, or at least, like, created space for these conversations, is how does the open source ecosystem create an opportunity to hold community, or to create the opportunity for civil society organizations or community-based organizations to hold governments or capital accountable. And if you could talk from experience or things that you've seen, that would be really useful, because I think that particular function is also something that we need to be thinking about in our own ecosystems?
Sure. I mean, I think you put your finger on it. Part of why open source is so appealing is that it's open. So it is transparent. Everybody can see it. And if the whole premise is that we all collaborate and we all work together, and by we, I mean whatever the community you're talking about, whatever the tool or piece of code is, you see everybody's contributions. And so I can see what you do, you can see what I do. If I see a security gap in what you do, I can patch it, and you can do the same. And over time, the idea is that it gets better because you have more eyeballs, you have more people involved, you have more diverse viewpoints, and then that is better than a team of 20 engineers sitting in an office somewhere thinking about just their viewpoint and what they want to build to maximize the profit for their company, right? And so you have that juxtaposition, and I think that's very powerful. And I think that that ability to have that transparency, it does lead to accountability of what that software and what that code is supposed to do and whether it's working well or not. And you can gain stature, and people will say, oh, you're one of the biggest, most active contributors to this repository, and you develop sort of social capital and are honored and respected and revered for contributing to something that becomes a public good. And I think that entire movement, and that is just a very powerful force. I think it's an easier answer to say that that can ensure corporate accountability because you offer a clear alternative to some proprietary systems. How it intersects with government, I think, is more complicated, but it is a very powerful force in that respect as well.
Yeah, of course. Please go ahead. Both of you want to respond, so yeah. Yeah, no, Arjun and then Anirudh. Yeah.
So this is, so without turning this into a debate, I'll just provide the counterfactual to this, right? So, so I think, and I grew up in the open source movement to the extent it existed in India through the early 2000s, late 90s, which was not very much. And I think the fundamental difference that at least as an Indian professional who did not come from means growing up trying to do the open source community kind of a development structure, what I realized is that it's also a little bit of, I mean, the hours you spend on it, if those hours are competing with livelihood, it becomes a huge challenge. And that tends to happen a lot more in the global south. And just as a result of that, the nature of open source here looks fundamentally different. And so you always have to have, in some sense, patrons, backers, contributors who are contributing and covering the cost of your doing that work. And without that, having indigenously developed open source becomes really hard. And this then translates further down. And in the AI age, I feel this is completely flipped, right? If you create a public good out of a data set, even through philanthropic investment, and you make it available to everybody, it's going to be available to everybody. And then the question of entrenchment, if somebody can pay for the bandwidth to download it off Amazon better than somebody else can, and it's 3 TB of data, it's very hard to then retain that sense of social capital growing by contribution with fidelity. So just adding that.
And also, like, I mean, and this thing of like there's labor around open source, which is often free, and then that freedom is either like in Spanish, like gratis, like if free of cost, but also free as in libre, which is like freedom. So there's a tussle between both of those as well.
Like the mukt and muft of unpaid care work.
Yeah. But Anirudh, over to you.
Yeah. So again, when we talk about AI, it's multiple things. And when we talk about open source AI, is it truly open source as what you mentioned, right? When the open source movement came about, it required a free exchange because come to think of it, it's probably the largest sort of democratic way of collaborating in the world, right? One of the biggest initiatives in the world, the open source movement. But some of the things that we think are open source right now are not really open source because the research is probably not open, the tooling, the software is not open, the source code is not open. Just because the LLM is open doesn't necessarily mean it's truly open. And again, what does that mean for when communities start adopting it? Like you said, the whole thing about labor comes in, who is contributing to it. It only works because it's remained free in the freedom sort of idea, the liberty sort of principles, where people are contributing to it, debating it, pushing back, and what works sort of stays resilient and survives. Uh, but I don't think we're using it in the right sort of um, terminology when we use open source AI. So again, it depends on the various layers of AI, what is truly open source. I think that also needs a little bit of pushback. Yeah,
I agree,
over
and
to
I
you.
think that question of like, if we are moving communities to this particular technology, then what is the meaning of open?
No, and just completely take and respect the point about we need a new business model for open source, I would argue. And I think we've reached a point where that's clear, that when it comes to unpaid indigenous labor to build something that benefits the all, how do you make it sustainable and how do you recognize that contribution? Because otherwise it is somewhat extractive, as you've said. And so I really, it's a fascinating question, and I don't necessarily have the answer to what is the new business model, but have some thoughts, and there are some new nonprofits that have been created of late that are trying to figure out how do you sustainably provide modern open source, open AI and AI related tools so that it becomes sustainable. Because if you look at the traditional models of open source software and how they're sustained, the largest ones, typically what you need to sustain it is you need medium to large corporations using the code base, and then their engineers and product people are in there, and it basically is sort of like this symbiotic where they contribute, they then pull, and then they're paid by their employer because it's core to their business. And then you have some individuals and you have some researchers, but really at its core is you need the people working for the companies who use the software. Otherwise, the open source software is not maintained and atrophies over time.
I'll come to you because, I mean, just on that is that two parts to this. One is like, how do we make sure that there's a business model? Because also what we've been seeing and in the conversations that have even happened over this course of this week is that there are big tech companies offering credits to, for use cases and specifically in health, in education. And that, I guess my question is that as communities do move, and even as you see in your own investments, move towards the use of AI, even if it's open AI, and then to Anirudh's question of what is open, etc., does this further increase the dependencies on certain kinds of technology companies that have the ability to process the models? And also then what are we doing is creating open data ecosystem that then also get, pushed into models. So how do we maintain the libre part of the freedom part while keeping other things constant?
I think I'll answer the business model piece first and then come to the Libre part, right? So, and a little bit to Eli's point as well. I think, so we experimented with this a little bit in 2022 from the Gates Foundation. We did a program called Sanmati, or Common Sense, where we worked with a startup that was doing data annotation with community workers called Karya, and we did some interesting work with them. We had them work with women from low resource communities who spoke 6 different Indian languages. And then first, I qualified what bias meant in their cultural context, and then figured out a process to annotate that in text corpora. And then they got paid for it. So there was something like 20,000 women who contributed to this data set, and that will hopefully soon be available as a public good. Now, this is the kind of stuff that we feel is stuff that we would want big tech to pick up. Yeah. It's completely fine. This is stuff that we can invest in. This is a public good that is universally valid in some sense. There might be other things though that need a more nuanced approach to creating that asset. And there are some interesting things that are happening there, right? So we see now agents hiring people, paying hourly rates. The more transparency we can bring to this pricing of effort, I feel that's where this will become more mature. And so just the way you can now price discover a GPUR, it should be possible to price discover hourly costs for an expert data annotator in a particular domain. I'm great at writing bad code on GitHub. I'm going to charge this much for it. And I feel like that evolution will happen faster than slower, and I'm increasingly optimistic about it, sort of counterintuitively.
And what about and is that the part to the?
Yeah, so I think so the Libre here is a truly Libre market.
Yeah.
That functions with equal levels of agency for or agents of all kind.
Yeah. did you want to respond to any of this? Because I have a question for you as well.
Okay. No, I'll just
Yeah.
come in there regarding the business model aspect of it. Again, when you look at open source, it was always led by people who are truly passionate about the project, who did it for the. It wasn't a hobby, but they wanted to solve, even if it was incrementally. And now it becomes a little more challenging when we try to frame it as a business model. So I just want to spotlight again one of the partners that we work with in the South. Um, it's called they call Tech for Good Community, where the idea is that they're also pushing forward the free and open source software movement, where they're working closely with communities and organizations who don't have access to say cloud credit, or who don't have access to say building those systems for websites or for um, animal management or whatever it is, right? So using this, they have created something called the idli stack, which is very interesting. The idea is that communities can come together to solve for those problems without breaking the bank, because obviously they're bound by the funds that they have to raise, and which is not a lot. And there aren't many organizations, many philanthropic foundations that actually fund this project. So philanthropic capital could be a great way to sort of continue this movement. It's largely patient. There is no expectation to sort of solve the problem immediately, or there is no motive for generating profit or talking about unit economics and things like that. So in some sense, I think philanthropy can step in to play a stronger role in pushing the debate towards making AI more open source and open. Yeah, thanks.
No, thanks for that. And also, just coming to the question I had for you is, I think that we've talked about the obviously the financing of it, the structure of it in some way, the use of it. But what I always struggle with is the institutional architectures around some of this. So I think that, like for instance, you mentioned philanthropic capital in Germany. There's the Sovereign Tech Fund, which actually is set up to support open source, and they have that wonderful like that that comic where you have the full stack and then there's this one little thing which is open source and being built by somebody sitting out of like their basement, and so that the idea is to support the little things, and this is public money, so the government of Germany has set up a fund to support open source innovation, which I think then goes to the notion of, you know, both the publicness of purpose and the publicness of capital, which may be leading to the freedom of the software. But and I just wondered, like, if you had thoughts on, as AI becomes entrenched, as it becomes potentially non-negotiable for community-based organizations, how do we create those institutional infrastructures, maybe the way that we have done for public utilities, or, you know, is there a way there to think of notions of publicness around open source?
That's a difficult one, because obviously we want this to be a public good where everybody has true access to it. And when we say access, again, are we talking about access to the data, the compute, the infrastructure? Are they part of the governance process? Are they part of mechanisms to make it more safe? So comparing it to the public utility model might be a bit far-fetched right now, but again, I think we need to think about, MATE is doing a fantastic job, at least making sure that the regulations are not too difficult to navigate, right? It's still light touch at the moment, so kudos to the ministry to also, who's been quite open to hearing feedback. So in that sense, maybe this will sort of encourage more innovation down the road. I think about the telecom example in India, right? Where back in the 90s, I'm sure a lot of us remember how expensive telecom was in terms of access, in terms of getting devices, in terms of the infrastructure. Everything was expensive. Everything was unavailable, and obviously it didn't get truly democratized. It didn't reach the rural areas. It didn't reach the most marginalized communities or the most vulnerable people. It took a long time, but that was also because policy stepped in, made things a little more easy to navigate. Competition sort of kicked in. So those sort of conditions sort of aligned. We can draw lessons from there, and we don't need to sort of wait for those mistakes to also get repeated. I think this could be a leapfrog moment where, if we do draw lessons from some of those, I mean, I don't want to think about other public utility. I don't know. Perhaps the other panelists could step in. But this came to mind. And now telecom has sort of enabled communities to sort of become a lot more confident, a lot more successful in what they are aiming to do, right? And this sort of several sort of layers got built on top of that, be it bank accounts, be it Aadhaar, identity, payments, everything sort of got built on that. And I think AI could sort of revolutionize something along those lines. Yeah.
Telecom is tricky because it's a duopoly in
Yeah.
India and no public option. But do you think that the governance frameworks around how do we make it available, how do we make sure talent exists, how do we make sure funding exists, how do we make sure that dependency don't exist? Is there like an ecosystem of institutions required, and especially as your role as a philanthropy, how do you think about that?
I think ecosystem is the right word. I do think that there are a constellation of different kinds of organizations that we need to all play their respective roles. My mind does not immediately leap to regulate AI like a public utility. I don't, not convinced, at least if you think about the public utility regulatory framework in the United States, that it's makes a ton of sense, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for government, a role for the private sector, a role for civil society, a role for the academy. And I think one of the challenges we're facing right now is the concentration of resources and power in a couple companies is just so far ahead of and everyone else is languishing, right? Governments are generally struggling to keep up. Many governments, including the Indian government, are getting very serious and having more expertise with the staff and same in the United States, but novel technologies are not typically an area that governments are particularly good at, right? And so there's always a lag there. The private sector gets ahead, the government tries to catch up. And then where does education, where does the university fit in, where does research, where does civil society, and who funds those latter groups, right? And the patient capital of philanthropy has a key role to play. And I think we're very much seeing how that ecosystem develops. And one of the really important things about this summit is there is a conversation about the ecosystem of actors, and many of them are present. There can always be more present, but I think in contrast, if you think about the summit in Paris last year, the diversity of participants from the Global South in particular is really notable and very important, because we need to think about a global ecosystem, and then we need to think about an ecosystem on the national levels. And so I think it's very much still playing out, and we still have some work to do.
And Arjun, I know that the Gates Foundation has been working a lot to create these ecosystems around openness, all the way from DPI and now to AI. And I think just from your vantage point, and specifically as a diagnostic for India, as we move towards this, global South, but also very specifically India question of like, how do we create this supportive ecosystem of companies, of talent, of civil society organizations, community organizations, researchers that can move this along?
I think, yes, absolutely. Ecosystems is a term that at least our team here at the India office uses a lot. And it's because we work a lot with the government, and India is pretty phenomenal in its ability to create ecosystems pretty much at will. And we've been getting faster and faster at it. So if you see the time it took for the ID movement to reach sort of what we call the plateau of productivity on the Gartner hype curve, it was a long time scale. And then UPI did it significantly faster. eKYC did it significantly faster. obviously there's healthy debate about this. What are the exclusions? What are the does it serve all use cases equally well? And that those are valid debates, and they should never stop because it's an important conversation to keep having. But in large part, we all, we all who are here from India have at this point used DPI in some way, shape, or form, and for the most part, it has worked for us. And it's a testament that we are able to do events like this at all. It would not be possible without the kind of ecosystem building that India has gotten good at. With the India AI mission, I think the example that I love to cite is the compute capacity built up in India very quickly. With a capital outlay of $1.2 billion, 40% of that reserved for compute subsidies, not capital investment. And then encouraging the Indian investor base to put in the investment to put out get the capacity built, get it empaneled, price discovered, available for use. And now we are at that point where we are now ready to find the use cases to consume that. And the question will be how much of what sort of capacity do we need, and how much of what sort of capacity is going to be feasible in the long run. And these are public decisions. I think to answer your question, the salience here lies in building the capacity for sound application of public funds, good procurement, being able to justify why you picked a product over another one, why you picked a vendor over another one, and then being able to monitor and evaluate that constantly to improve it at an iterative pace. And even if you did all of that, you would still have scenarios where you'd get stuck in local minimas. Gradient descent doesn't work any better for large human systems than it does for models. And so there is a need to keep engaging in this discourse of what truly constitutes public. Creation of public goods is very different from operation of public infrastructure. While the physical assets that create a road might be owned collectively by all of us, if you have more cars on the road than the road can handle, you will have traffic jams. There is no question about it, and you will need structures to address those sort of consumption asymmetry issues that will keep cropping up, and that is the nature of living systems. And that's what we build societies for. So I think that's where we're going.
No, thank you for that. And I always appreciate when procurement finds its way in very lofty conversations because it comes down to the boring things. We're in our last 15 minutes, and I would love to open it up to the audience. I know you guys have been listening patiently. Can someone give a mic? Thank you.
I could probably speak like
It might be
it's
recorded.
being live streamed.
Yeah. Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you for the nice talk. You covered a lot of topics, open source and other things, access to AI. Don't you think that it might be a little hard to control open source, but how about the control of data itself? And I'm not talking about short-term control where you monetize the data, but long-term control where there's an infrastructure, something like data union, you know. And this is not about the data that's coming in through web or other means. The new generation of data that's getting now needed, which will be used by the agents. So have you had projects that are coming up, especially for a country like India, it might become a new source of income and a long-term income for people when the jobs are getting, the wage stagnation is happening and wage suppression. It's true for US too. So have you seen those projects coming in? That'll give more power in the hands of people and, decide where the AI has to go rather than a few people controlling it.
It's for Eli?
All of you, yeah.
All of you. Okay, great.
I think it's a great question. I think I don't have a perfect answer for you just because the new innovative models for sort of how do you think about ownership over data, monetization of it, are something we're still researching and exploring, have not yet sort of focused on that in our grant making, but it's something that is top of mind and that I'm following. And so perhaps one of my colleagues on the panel may have better examples for sort of things that they have already noticed or already supported that are more responsive to what you're pointing at.
To keep it short, no, we're not supporting any organizations or initiatives on that. But Mr. Pramod Verma has an excellent paper on decentralized data flows. He's just brought it out yesterday. So I'm yet to read it, but that's something that you could look towards. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, I don't think we're doing anything. We've done stuff with data in the past, where we did one piece of work with the Indian Institute of Science, where the question was, how do you have better um, automated speech recognition and text-to-speech transcription for financial and agricultural use cases in Indian languages. Now, this is a nuanced data set, and this was a while ago and slightly pre-GPT drop, because this was still the days of neural machine translation being the leading piece of work, right? So you needed data pairs. And one of the structures we found the best way to create that good was to purchase the data. And then the next iteration of that was, okay, you can purchase the data and then you can pay somebody to work on top of that data with effort, and then you have a clear price point. And now we are taking that to the next step with folks like the Nudge, who are now figuring out a common digital skills framework. So you could have a certification saying, this is my amount of work that I've done, and therefore I should be paid this much for an hour of annotation on this data set. That said, these are all very early. Data laws in the world are less than 20 years old, in the most part. I mean, there's IPR, which is older, but digital data laws are relatively newer. I don't think there's enough precedent in the environment to have enough nuance on this debate. There are kinds of data, there are personal, non-personal is just two distinctions we've now gotten to very clearly in law. There will be other distinctions that will have to come forward, and that nuance will only come as we keep engaging with this, we keep disagreeing with it, arguing with it, and as those conflicts resolve, we will hopefully go from sanmati or common sense to sammati or consensus.
But just to add, I mean, we've been looking at a lot of these as Apti Institute over the last 7 years, looking at models for bottom-up data governance and how do we help communities extract value, but also safeguard that resource. There's a lot of work that's happened with indigenous communities in New Zealand and Australia and Canada, where there are more nuanced notions of exercising community data rights, so that it's not monetized, but it is as Arjun said, in the notion of agency. We've also been working with cooperatives that allow for data pooling so that data can be unlocked for specific use cases. There is power in that, but it is complicated legally because we only understand data rights as individual rights. So you don't have the ability to collectively negotiate around some of these questions. And that is something that we've been working at. And there are interesting business models also that emerge, which is that, you add carbon data to carbon credits, and that enriches the credits, and then you can use that to pay communities back. So there are little things like labor dues are part of like business models that unions are starting to use, but definitely not at the scale at which we want them. But any other questions from the audience? Thank you, Prerna.
Very good morning to all. So my question is regarding like how AI can practically use to reduce poverty and at the grassroots level. For all the panelists, I have the questions, while ensuring it creates new livelihood opportunity rather than replacing existing jobs. So I would like to know.
So, I mean, I think the answer is it's complicated, right? I mean, I do think the potential for sort of labor displacement and AI taking jobs, we're seeing that impact hit different industries differently. And I think what we're thinking a lot about and what I think is needed more is more accurately projecting out to the extent we can which kinds of jobs are going to be impacted and how quickly, because the intervention, the response is going to vary depending on the kind of the job that you're talking about, and there isn't going to be just like a single solution that works for everything. And I think part of the challenge is it's perhaps the most important question that we need to answer right now, and we need better data to answer it. We need to model that data, and then we need a very complicated, frankly, I think, set of government interventions to then figure out which jobs are protected, which ones are changing the incentives, which ones are you thinking about reskilling and retraining. I mean, how do you even educate software engineers going forward, given that most entry-level software engineering jobs are going away? And there are answers to that question, and there are experiences in the past in education and sort of reskilling and upskilling where you have to leapfrog an entire sort of multi-year period of experience that gets you from a level 0 to a level 5 or whatever. But I think the answer is it's messy and complicated, and there isn't sort of like one singular thing. But there are probably some examples that.
Yeah, I mean, any answer I give right now is going to sound a bit canned because the general response to this, and this is pretty much going to sound like an LLM with a vector problem, is that you essentially want to look at things that augment human capability rather than replace it. It's probably something you've heard many people say on many panels in this event. But I think it's important to kind of double click on that and see what does that mean. I think what it means is that we now need to reconsider a lot of things that we've predicated a lot of our structures on. And I like to use the example of horse riding and cars, right? And for the longest time, most cultures in the world prized horse riding. And that came with its inherent biases. If you were not proportionally sized along a horse, whether you were a man or a woman, your potential chances of a career in horse riding was impacted by that. And then cars came along, and people who potentially can't walk can also drive cars now. And so a lot of horse riders who were potentially going to have great careers didn't work out for them, and now people who couldn't walk can walk or drive. It's these are evolutionary changes, and it's an adaptation question, right? So it's really important to start looking around and seeing what have we not been paying attention to, what has not been given due importance. We've not talked enough about nuance of power, agency, control. It's not been done enough in the world. Maybe now that we're not writing so much software, maybe we'll have time to do that. We don't know yet. But it's a journey, and we're all on it together. So please, let's keep talking.
So, but my question is towards the poverty. How can we reduce poverty? Like
Thank you.
Just to also add, I think that that structural question is really important, because as we're also thinking about the deployment of limited resources, whether philanthropic or government, the question of do we support the structural questions of, like, you know, the schools that need to exist, the actual healthcare on the ground, or is there a way to think, you know, to spend that money to build the new?
Can I just
Yeah, of
also
course.
just come in there? So we visited a few partners, at least potential partners down south, and what we have, thanks to the AI summit, thanks to the large push, thanks to the global sort of cooperation on this, everybody is talking AI. So much so that there are organizations which are now just needlessly buying GPUs and stockpiling it, not realizing that they don't have the capacity to use it. They don't have a functioning building. They don't have a functioning organization, but they're building their computational labs. They're buying all these hardwares and keeping it, not necessarily being deployed towards social impact. And these are non-profits working in this space, or academic institutions. Like, then what is the point, right? So there needs to be those discussions also that's brought in. I mean, I was referring to what Arjun had mentioned earlier. So anyway, over to you, Asta.
Just the last question, and
I think it's a response to the question on how can we do poverty alleviation, and some thoughts from my end is that you're talking about taking the digital public goods to the grassroots level and increasing the digital literacy of the grassroots workers, providing them more livelihoods, and using AI to build digital public goods that can be accessed for the development of the country. And if you see that Ministry of IT has common service centers on the ground, right? They have the youth who are servicing these 150,000, 650,000 across the country. And here they are actually training the youth to come forward. So there is public-private partnership here to get more and more youth at the grassroots level to use AI for their, whether it's education, for their livelihoods, or to even create organizations that they might want to, enterprises they might want to build. That would be taking it to the grassroots level by increasing the capacity of the people who are at the grassroots level. I think that's the way I see it, because I've been in the sector for 30 years now. So thank you.
thank you for that. I'm sorry we're all out of time, but we can talk as we exit. But thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I think it meandered a little bit, but fruitfully so. And I think that it's really wonderful to be able to have this conversation. I know we have the next 2.5 odd days still left of the summit, so we'll keep an eye out on some of these issues, and then, you know, getting into it's not an easy problem. It's all very complicated, but I think like you said, that we have the ability to start thinking about it is already a step in the right direction. So thank you to the panelists, and thank you to the organizers. Thank you.